Due Process, awarded the 2005 New York Emmy for Societal Concerns Programming.
It's been 12 years since the first attack on the World Trade Center, nearly 9 years before 9/11. The terrorists remain in federal prison, but now there's been a civil verdict. It's raised a storm of controversy and put the Port Authority on the firing line. Who should pay the price for terrorism? Up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, a private foundation focusing on New Jersey public policy issues. Additional funding provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual and online legal reference, elaw.com.
"9/11 was so huge, so horrific, that we may not remember the first terrorist attack on the World Trade Center nearly 9 years before. But it was that bombing that finally found its way to a civil jury in New York State, a case that ended with a bombshell of its own, a highly controversial verdict that holds the Port Authority twice as responsible as the terrorists themselves. How could they have reached that surprising conclusion? I'm Raymond Brown, and that's the question we'll be asking here in the studio with a lawyer for the bombing victims and the prosecutor in the original federal criminal case. But first, with the story behind the verdict, here's Sandy King.
Raymond, it was the Port Authority that owned and ran the Trade Center back in 1993, and it's now the Port Authority that could literally have to pay. The greatest price was paid, of course, by the dead and injured, and no one denies that the bombers were terrorists. But it may fall on the Port Authority to compensate the victims in a really big way, 13 years after that bomb went off. This was where it started, with a terrorist bomb in a rented van exploded in the garage just beneath the Twin Towers.
Where you are, okay? This is the actual crater or near ground zero. If you want to get a little closer, you can. Good God.
Most were safely evacuated.
We just all got down from the 105th floor. Everybody was orderly. Smoke, but heavy smoke. We all came down. We're okay.
But once the smoke had cleared, the body count began. 6 dead, 1,000 injured. An attack that paled nearly 9 years later when the towers were hit by the unthinkable, with a death toll in the thousands. But while the trauma of February 1993 was on a decidedly smaller scale, it's continued to loom large for the victims and their families. The accused terrorists were quickly caught. They were tried in federal court and convicted 10 years ago.
Certainly the events of September 11th have obscured, to some extent in the public's eye, what did happen in 1993.
But the civil suits in New York State Court have lingered, and it wasn't until now that a civil jury had its say about blame.
We all bear some level of responsibility for the fact that terrorists have been able to perpetuate these attacks.
In fact, the New York jury was ruling only on the matter of blame. The criminal case put guilt squarely on the terrorists, but this civil jury, looking at the claims of 400 plaintiffs, weighed the responsibility in a different way.
The outcome is not entirely surprising, given the facts that the plaintiffs were able to present in the litigation.
The jury's bottom line assessed percentage of blame in a way that has shaken the Port Authority, one that could impact not just the victims and their families, but the region's bridges and tunnels, airports and trains.
I think it's premature to have a conversation about it, but...
Port Authority Chairman Anthony Kosha was quoted by the New York Times as saying that the case, which seeks up to $1.8 billion in damages, could lead not only to cuts in spending, but even to hikes in tolls and fares. So his comment to the cameras in an impromptu news conference was a classic understatement.
Well, obviously we're disappointed in the jury's verdict.
Because that verdict placed 32% of blame on the terrorists, 68% on the Port Authority.
I think it is inappropriate for the Port Authority to have the disproportionate responsibility that jury verdict indicated.
I can understand that that would provoke some questions and some reactions that the courts have gotten it wrong here.
So how could a jury have concluded that the bi-state agency was twice as responsible as the men who conspired and planted the bomb?
Powerful evidence. The plaintiffs presented evidence showing that the Port Authority had commissioned experts on terrorism to write reports evaluating the risks of terrorist attacks against the World Trade Center.
Jurors said they'd been influenced by a 1985 report from the Port Authority's own security. It cautioned that the garage could be a prime target for terrorists.
Several of the reports predicted the exact event that occurred, which was a truck bomb in the sub-basement parking garage of the World Trade Center.
This agency that suffered a horrendous loss in 2001 understands security. And to a great degree, we all understand the sentiment of those who were injured or hurt by it in February of 1993.
But the plaintiffs' lawyers used the Port Authority's internal warning as proof that the agency knew the risk and could have prevented the '93 attack.
Now, those are very damaging facts, obviously, for the Port Authority, and apparently the jury found them to be extremely important.
But could 9/11 2001 have also had its influence on the jury?
I think the fact that September 11th did occur made it really likely that the jury was going to find the 1993 terrorist attack a foreseeable event. I mean, you know, what could seem more foreseeable to us now than a terrorist attack right in the heart of Manhattan?
The Port Authority will appeal, but if that fails, a second trial will determine if the agency will be forced to pay out hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars to people like these. That over and above the staggering amounts the Port Authority's already spending on security.
And I will tell you, apart from this jury verdict, that this agency will incur an annual cost of somewhere between $300 to $400 million a year on providing the kind of security that we feel is appropriate to adequately safeguard our customers. What we will not do is cut corners on security for financial reasons.
Then where would the Port Authority get the cash to pay what could be nearly $2 billion in damages? That on top of settlements already reached with the estates of 5 of the 6 people killed in the bombing. Fare and toll hikes could just be the start of hard times for the bi-state agency, which expected some finding of negligence, but nothing, Raymond, like what it got from the jury.
But will the verdict hold up on appeal? We'll put that question and more to a lawyer for the plaintiffs, to a professor of tort law, and to the former federal prosecutor who 10 years ago won convictions against the terrorists.
The Port Authority was 2/3 at fault versus the terrorists themselves. Well, I don't know.
The terrorists are the ones that did the crime, and they're the ones that are responsible for it.
More liable than the terrorists themselves? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
Some of the blame might lie with them, but certainly not 2/3. They should have secured the garage the best they could, but the terrorists obviously had made plans superior to their security.
How can you really predict, you know, what's going to happen and be prepared for every situation?
They have some responsibility in it, but ultimately the terrorists are the ones who did the bombing.
I think they're both to blame. Should have been more security.
Just how surprised should we be by a verdict that places twice the blame and all of the financial liability on the Port Authority and not on the terrorists? We're likely to get some very different answers from former federal prosecutor Andrew McCarthy. Now a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, he led the prosecution of the first World Trade Center terrorists. From Rutgers Camden Law Professor Jay Feinman, who will guide us through the sometimes quirky world of torts. And in Newark, from Blair Fensterstock, lead counsel for the 400 civil cases arising out of the 1993 bombing. Welcome to all of you. Before we get started, let me make a quick disclaimer. For about 6 years with my dad, I represented the city of Newark in suits against the Port Authority having nothing to do with this issue. Blair, let me start with you. I think the question that's on a lot of minds is there a key factor, a key fact or a key argument that you think led this jury to reach the verdict that they did?
Raymond, I think there is. I think the key factor, according to the jurors, and we talked to the jurors afterwards, was that Peter Goldmark, the executive director of the Port Authority, predicted that car bombs were the weapons of choice for terrorists abroad, that they were coming to the United States, and that the Port Authority should commission a report and undergo a study to prevent a catastrophic event in the garage at the World Trade Center. As a result of that study, working with the CIA, the FBI, Scotland Yard, and others, the Port Authority predicted that this very event, that is, driving a car with a bomb down into the garage, could cause a catastrophic event. The Port Authority decided to do nothing. And the reason the Port Authority decided to do nothing, in their own reports, was revenue loss. The Port Authority never was able to qualify or quantify the amount of revenue loss. And in fact, all the Port Authority had to do was close the transient parking in the garage. They would keep the tenant parking, and they could replace transient parking with tenant parking. The Port Authority refused to do that. They essentially invited the terrorists into the garage.
Let me ask, Andy, what's your reaction to the notion that jurors embraced a report that seemed to predict an event and which was not the basis of action by the Port Authority as an explanation for this verdict?
I think it's a terrible explanation and it's a terrible result.
Why so?
One of the unexamined, inexplicable miracles of modern time is the fact that only 6 people were killed in the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. In fact, we showed that in that particular area of Lower Manhattan, at any point in the day, and particularly the point of the day around noon that we're talking about, there were between 80 and 120,000 people in just that vicinity. What this verdict says to me is it's almost as if someone is saying if the Port Authority had taken better precautions, this wouldn't have happened and people wouldn't have died. In point of fact, the terrorists would have found a different target had they not been able to infiltrate this one. And more than likely, had the bomb gone off outside the building instead of inside the building, many more people would have died than actually did.
Jay, let me ask you a question that may help the viewers a little bit. In the report that we showed the viewers before we began our discussion, Professor Gonzalez uses the term foreseeability. Now, I know you can spend a whole semester with your students on that term, but can you succinctly tell us what that means and how that might relate to what Blair says was the juror reaction in terms of this verdict?
Well, Raymond, it's quite simple. What we have to do when we have a tort case is predict how likely it is that harm would occur through certain behavior, which the plaintiffs in this case say is careless. If you're driving your car and it's raining and it's night and you're driving under the speed limit but too fast, it's foreseeable, it's likely that you're going to cause an accident. And if you do and someone's injured, you'll be responsible for it. That's the calculation the jury had to make in this case.
So that might explain the focus of this jury on a report that seemed to predict the event and was followed by inadequate action.
That's exactly right.
Blair, let me ask you a question which is an impossible one to answer. And that is, the jury verdict was rendered after 9/11. Certainly the mantra in the United States that 9/11 changed everything means that these were jurors who are rendering a verdict in the shadow of what turned out to be a far more lethal attack, the 9/11 attack. Can you say whether or not you think that experience influenced the verdict? Might we have gotten a different verdict had this case gone to trial in 2000?
Raymond, it's an interesting question. It's something that we as trial lawyers examined and the judge examined. The fact of the matter is the judge directed, as was to his best ability, that the jurors should ignore 9/11. The lawyers were directed to avoid mentioning 9/11. So we all cooperated in trying to
But you're a pretty experienced lawyer, and you know one of the challenges in trying cases is to get jurors to ignore something that may be sitting like a big boulder in the middle of the room.
But remember, Raymond, that 9/11 was very different from the 1993 bombing. 9/11 involved determined terrorists. What we had in 1993 were not brilliant terrorists. These guys were idiots. These guys cased the joint. These guys went back to get their receipt for their Ryder truck. They were not suicide bombers like the 9/11 bombers. So the events were really quite different.
Let me ask you, Andy, whether or not you think that the men who attacked in 93 were pale in their skill compared to the 9/11 attackers, which is one of the distinctions that Blair's drawing.
You don't need to be a rocket scientist to be a terrorist. I think we could start with that as a premise. But in point of fact, the 1993 Trade Center bomb was a very complicated chemical urea nitrate explosive, a highly unusual crystal, such that it even was difficult for the people who were doing the forensic work at the time to recognize it. I don't think I'd jump to the conclusion that the 9/11 hijacker suicide bombers were brilliant because of the way they succeeded, and the 93 guys were knuckleheads because they did a couple of dumb things that resulted in them being caught. The important thing, I think, for this one is that this had never happened before in the United States in 1993. It wasn't like we had a pattern of behavior. This was a first.
But you've had to, of necessity, I'm sure, do comparisons in your mind. Do you think this verdict would likely have been influenced by 9/11?
I don't think there's any question that it was influenced by 9/11. I mean, to say, put it out of your mind is like asking me right now to put out of my mind that I'm in beautiful southern New Jersey. I mean, it's just preposterous.
Jay, one of the other issues that I think astounds lay people who aren't familiar with the civil justice system is how could a jury find in effect that the Port Authority, however negligent, was more responsible than people who acted intentionally? Is there an easy explanation for how the law might produce that result?
Well, there's not an easy explanation because the explanation depends on sitting through the trial, hearing the evidence, listening to the judge's instructions. But clearly, in a case like this, the jurors don't have the terrorists in front of them, in a sense. They have the Port Authority. And they want to exercise the sense of the community in assigning some blame. And it's at least possible that they recognized that these victims deserve to be compensated. And the only means of doing that was imposing liability on the Port Authority.
Let me go back to Blair. Blair, we all obviously function in a system in which the assumption is that jurors pay attention to instructions, but all of us know that jurors are human beings. And the inference I draw from what Jay says, and it's certainly been suggested elsewhere, is that deep pockets were in effect. People were sympathetic to your clients because of what they had suffered. They knew that nobody was going to sue the men who've been incarcerated by Andy, and so the logical deep pocket was the Port Authority. Is it possible that that thinking might have entered into the mind of one or more jurors?
I don't think so, and the reason is this was a bifurcated trial. In other words, this was a trial on liability. No damages, no evidence of injuries, no evidence of suffering.
But you would select jurors who are intelligent because you had a nuanced case, and don't most jurors understand, even in a case where liability is tried first and then damage is tried, if there's a finding, don't you think jurors understand that one may follow the other and make those connections if they want to?
Absolutely, but you have to remember, the testimony of the Port Authority in this case was catastrophic to them. Stephen Berger, the executive director of the Port Authority, who determined not to close the garage, testified, quote, "I have no regrets. I have no regrets. People died. He had no regrets." What did you expect a jury to do under those circumstances, Raymond?
One of the focuses is the question of duty. That is, it seems to me that what Blair is saying is that when you look at duty, then jurors may say, well, the departure from duty of the Port Authority was so significant that we're going to find them more liable. Is that a possible line of thinking that might explain this?
Well, let's take an analogy. This case is like one in which the operator of a store has a parking lot which is poorly lit, not guarded, has been the scene of crimes before. They're going to be responsible for failing to exercise reasonable care to protect their patrons when a crime occurs. And this case may be something like that.
So, Andy, why does this verdict trouble you, given the fact that no one is making the case that the men who did the attack should be exonerated in any sense, but simply saying where there was a duty on the part of an institution that had its own experts telling them this would happen, that they should be responsible, and that's explanation of the verdict?
Because I think that this is a situation that transcends normal criminal justice and civil justice issues. This is a situation where, in my mind at least, and I think in the minds of many others, the 1993 attack was militant Islam's declaration of war against the United States. If you're a nation and you're in a war, I think the patriotic thing is for the country to pull together and confront the enemy, and things like this, this verdict, which finds somebody who is essentially a victim to be 2/3 responsible, and the people who carry it out are actually responsible.
So your argument isn't really a legal argument so much as a policy or a moral or an argument that goes to another level?
The system that the law depends on, the system that our legal system depends on, is our country, is our national security. I think when we're in a war situation, it's important that the country pull together, and this pulls us apart.
So that you're looking at something bigger. Let me drop down one notch and ask you this question, Blair. The numbers that have been thrown out, 1.8 billion, are huge numbers. And we're talking about a bi-state public agency, which is saying that it will have tremendous effect on its function if these claims are satisfied. Number one is, and I'm not asking you to negotiate against yourself on television, but is 1.8 billion a number that's kind of frozen in stone, or is that a number that's likely to be reduced if the liability holds up and negotiations commence? I mean, is that number realistic, and should people be concerned as they focus on it? Because I think that's been one of the sources of concern.
Well, that's two questions, Raymond.
Okay.
First of all, the $1.8 billion is a number that's been thrown out by the Port Authority. The plaintiffs have never thrown out a number at all. Okay. I don't believe the number is anything close to that. The second thing the Port Authority fails to point out, in crying poverty while they're raising rates on the George Washington Bridge and through the tunnels, is that they have insurance. They have a ton of insurance that covers this.
Blair, quickly, what would the Port Authority's motive be for throwing out this large number?
Well, that's a good question. That is a very good question. Do they ever throw out the fact that they have a huge amount of insurance to cover this liability? Do they ever throw out the fact?
Let me ask you, Andy's body language, he's going to have a button pop if we don't ask him. What's your response to that?
This is all a pass-along. The public is going to pay for this. So ultimately what we're saying is it's we, the American people, who are responsible for Ramzi Youssef's bomb, which killed 6 of our fellow Americans, injured 1,000, and caused billions in damages. I mean, that's ultimately where this goes.
But isn't that what torts is about, deciding where we put the burden of a loss in order to try to make people whole and yet keep society going?
We do that for two reasons. One is to compensate the victims, and there's no other scheme of doing this. This isn't like 9/11, where Congress stepped in and said we'll have essentially an after-the-fact insurance program. Right. The other reason is to provide an incentive for someone to be safe. If I injure someone driving my car and I don't have enough insurance, no one feels sorry for me.
Okay, I got 90 seconds left, so from each of you I need a prediction about the future. Blair, what's going to happen in the Court of Appeals? Ultimately, is this verdict going to be upheld?
This verdict will be affirmed.
Right. Andy, you've talked about some other social consequences. Assume Blair is right. What do you see as bad consequences flowing from this? And I know it's hard to ask you that in 30 seconds, but you're concerned about it.
I don't know why anybody would ever take the step hereafter to do common sense security measures and to, examine their premises to think about where are we vulnerable. So I think ultimately we're less safe because the incentive we create is to not do the kinds of things that create a paper trail that civil liability can be premised on.
So you see big, serious consequences. Jay, let me ask you this. What would you do if you were in the appellate courts? But would it shock you if this verdict was affirmed by the appellate courts?
It wouldn't shock me at all. This is the way the civil justice system works. Sometimes it works well, and we have the appellate court to review the jury in this case.
And what do you think about the policy arguments that Andy's making, that really there are deeper issues that are affected by the way this verdict has come out and would be affected if it was affirmed?
Well, there are deeper issues, but we resolve those deeper issues on the basis of law rather than the basis of saying the Port Authority can't afford it or there's a political reason for avoiding the decision in this case.
And finally, Blair, do you think the Port Authority is trying to influence the courts by talking about those big numbers?
Absolutely. The Port Authority, from day one of jury selection, put an ad in the newspaper trying to impact.
Both the case and the controversy are going to go on, but we're out of time. Our thanks to Andrew McCarthy, to Blair Fensterstock, to Jay Feynman. For Sandy King and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown, hoping you'll join us next week for yet another edition of Due Process.
We're disappointed in the jury's verdict. The 93 bombing was a horrendous event. 6 people were killed on that day. 4 of them were Port Authority employees. And certainly this agency that suffered a horrendous loss in 2001 understands security. And to a great degree, we all understand the sentiment of those who were injured or hurt by it in February of 1993. But we all bear some level of responsibility for the fact that terrorists have been able to perpetuate these attacks. I think it is inappropriate for the Port Authority to have the disproportionate responsibility that jury verdict indicated, and we intend to appeal it. And ultimately, we feel strongly that a more appropriate resolution of that issue will be achieved.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, a private foundation focusing on New Jersey public policy issues. Additional funding provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual and online legal reference, elaw.com.